Hello, and welcome to my reading of my book, Missionary Life, with Billy and Joe Wilson. Today, I'll be reading chapter 18. Kigali, Rwanda was such an easy country to get into, and many modern conveniences were developing. Besides it being a beautiful country and the land of 1,000 hills, it was called, and we had so many visitors that wanted to come and visit with us. We had family that came to visit, my sister Nancy and her daughter Teresa. And then we had visiting teachers for the Bible school that came and stayed with us. We had a spacious home, and so we welcomed people to come and stay with us. I think I worked harder there than I ever had, printing, collating, binding all the textbooks. I went through several seminars that taught me how to teach English as a second language, and I enjoyed doing this very much. Billy was working on his master's degree through Global University, and he finally graduated in 2005. With a Master of Arts degree in Biblical Studies. This was a much-needed tool that he would use to train trainers and leaders in French and in English in Rwanda and other African countries. Most of the time, we both stayed very busy. During the week, I worked in the library, printing the books, and Billy was either teaching or helping to build a church somewhere, or preparing sermons to preach on the weekends. Many times we left on Saturday to preach in one of the many churches, driving many miles and over some very rough roads. We have several videos of going through mud holes or up a very steep mountain. The youth of the Assemblies of God purchased vehicles for missionaries. So we were blessed to have a four-wheel drive and pretty reliable car. We're so thankful for Speed the Light. We usually had a Rwandan pastor or a translator in the car with us to show us the way, as there was no GPS. Or sometimes we needed the translator to get out and guide us over a rickety wooden bridge. Most of the time, I closed my eyes and prayed, and God protected us. I had lifted some very heavy sacks, and I had hurt my back. On some of these trips, I should have stayed home, as the ride could be pretty rough. But staying home was never in my thoughts. I always went, in pain or no pain. Many people have asked me, what was the hardest part of being in Africa? I always answered, using the bathrooms. Well, that might sound crude, but it was the truth. If there had been rest areas along the way, as there are here in America, it would not have been so hard. But there was nowhere on the side of the road for a woman to go. It was a bit easier for Billy, as it was common to see a man with his back to the road, even though you couldn't see what he was doing, you knew. I probably did permanent damage to my kidneys, as I had a routine that I did the day before we would drive into the countryside. About 4 p.m. in the evening, I would stop drinking any liquids at all. I would not drink anything until I returned home. Of course, this kept me from needing a restroom most of the time. I do remember 2 times that this method did not work, and I had to go no matter the circumstance. We had arrived at the church, and it was way far out in the bush area. I asked my translator to find me the closest toilet, as I could not walk very far. My back was hurting from the ride, but my need for a toilet was greater. Anytime I would ask to use the toilet, the person I asked would get this panic look on their face. It was because I was an American woman, and they knew, or so they thought, I would not want to use their toilets, and it was always just a hole in the ground with sometimes only 3 walls and a roof. Sometimes there was no hole. You went behind a bush. This was the typical outhouse that churches would have. But the ones for their homes would be a bit better. Some of them, cement floors and wooden doors. And so on this day, the translator ran to the pastor's wife and told her my problem. And she instructed her to take me to the nearest home with a better toilet than the church had. This meant a very long walk and into a neighbor's backyard area where the toilet building sat high up on a hill. I will never know how I made it that day, but I do remember saying, "Jesus, help me," all the way there and climbing the hill to the nicest toilet they could think of for the white woman to use. One other time, I met a lady in the church. She could speak English. She talked to me a lot because she didn't have anyone else to practice her English with. I became so comfortable around her that when we were ready to leave, I felt I could ask her to show me where the nearest toilet was. She said, "Oh, sure, just follow me." And we started walking down the road. After a few minutes, we met a man coming toward us. She stopped and spoke with him a minute, and then she said to me, "Just follow him. He will show you where to go." I wanted so bad to say, "Oh, never mind," but it was too late. And as he happily led me down the road, we arrived at his home and went in the front door. His wife and children sat in the front room. They all greeted me as if I was someone they knew. Then he takes me through the house and out the back door, and then down a little path to the outdoor toilet. He asked me if I needed a bucket of water. I politely said, "No, thank you," and showed him that I had a Kleenex in my pocket. When I finished, he was waiting at the back door to walk me back through his living room and back to the church. Maybe you can see why I always told people that using the bathroom was the hardest thing about living in Africa. As I'm talking about our visits to the churches, I have to say also that the highlight of each trip was the meal that we were always served. Sometimes the meal was a melt-in-your-mouth delicious taste. Other times, I couldn't quite recognize the meat, or maybe there were lots of flies to contend with. But no matter what, we were always humbled by the sacrifice and the work that went into feeding us everywhere we went. It was unheard of to visit a pastor in his church and not be served a meal. One such meal stands out in my mind that I will never forget. It was Christmas, and in Rwanda, the thing to do on Christmas Day is to go to church. A pastor had invited us to come and preach that day, and then afterwards we walked over to his house to eat lunch. a table was spread with a huge meal that included boiled meat, rice, cooked bananas, and greens and beans. On the table also was a 2-liter Coke. I asked the pastor if it was normal for him to give Christmas presents to his children, and he said, "Oh, yes, this Coke is their Christmas present." Needless to say, I didn't pour myself a glass of Coke that day. And one other story I have thought about that is not written in my book, but I'm going to go ahead and tell it on here today. I remember one time we were in a village, and the pastor and his wife had invited us into their home, prepared a huge meal, and set it before us. I looked over into the pot of meat and didn't fully recognize anything. It looked to me like guts. That's what it looked like, intestines. And so I found a bone with a piece of meat on it, and that was what I put in my plate and thought I had gotten by with that. But the man of the house comes over to the table. He reaches down into that pot, and he brings out a piece of those intestines, and he places them on my plate. And he looks at me and he says to everyone in the room, "Because you are our honored guest, we want to honor you by giving you the choicest piece of food in this house," as he laid the intestines on my plate. Quick as a wink, I think it was the Lord helping me. I reached down with my spoon, picked up the piece of meat, quickly put it over on Billy's plate, and I said to the man, "Because I honor my husband greatly, I will give him this piece of meat. Thank you so much."